Today I'm sharing my favorite books of 2023. Welcome back to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. Today I'm going to share my favorite fiction books of 2023, my favorite nonfiction books, a couple of books that were rereads that would make it into the favorite category, and quite a few honorable mentions. So I'm going to be going through the favorites in order of when I read them through the year. Every month I would have one, sometimes two favorites. So there are more than 12 favorites because some months there was a tie. The very first book I read in 2023, The Printed Letter Bookshop by Catherine Rea. I am not 100% sure how to pronounce her name. As soon as I finished this book, I wanted to read all of the books by her that I could get my hands on. I loved this book so much that even though it was the very first book of the year, it is probably in the top 5 favorite of all of these, if not the favorite of the fiction. This story has a young girl named Madeline who has gone back to the town where her father is from because she has inherited her Aunt Maddie's bookshop. At first, she just plans on kind of getting it into order and selling it. But then as she is working there, you start learning the stories of a few of the different people that work in the Printed Letter Bookshop and getting to know the townspeople, and she gets to know her family better. And she really finds out things about herself that she had kind of lost since she was younger. There was one character in this book that I did not like at all, and yet by the end I was rooting for her. There was one character that I related to in so many ways that her story became really touching to me. I cried in this book. I was so invested in these characters and in this town. And I also like that a lot of her books take place in the northern Illinois area, and we used to live in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and so we spent a lot of time in these areas, either driving through or visiting them for specific purposes. A lot of times her books take me back to a place that I've been before. So I loved this book. Next is Shadows of Swansea Abbey by Julie Klassen. This book was pitched to me as an Agatha Christie meets Jane Austen, and I was sold by that. And I read it and I wasn't disappointed. I really, really enjoyed this. The main character, Rebecca, returns to her village that she is from after being away for years. And her brother asks her to go and stay at the nearby Swansea Abbey to deliver his manuscript to an author that is staying there. This hotel used to be a monastery, and it's rumored to be haunted. While she's there, there is a murder in the abbey, and so there is a lot of mystery and intrigue. She starts seeing things around the abbey that make her wonder if it really is haunted or what is going on. And it was just a really interesting read. And this also sent me down a rabbit hole of Julie Klassen books. She and Catherine Rea both have become people that I've been buying their books all year long. And Julie Klassen has a lot of books. So I've been reading her all year. She has quickly become one of my favorite authors for historical romance. Next on the list is In Myrtle Peril by Elizabeth C. Bunce. This is the 4th book in the Myrtle Hardcastle series. This is a young girl that loves to investigate, and she just happens to have these mysteries and murders happen around her, and her governess is great. She's great. I love her personality. I love her dad. I love the other characters in the book. I love the stories. I love her writing. She has little footnotes on it throughout the book that make it sound like they're notes from maybe a book that Myrtle has put together later. These are just really fun middle grade mysteries, and I do have the newest one in the series, but I'm saving it for middle grade March, so hopefully that will be a favorite of the next year as well. Next, I'm going to talk about the Sinclair Mysteries. This is also kind of a middle grade, but more, I would think a little bit older middle grade. I would say this is YA the way YA was when I was growing up, whereas now, to me, YA seems to have a lot of adult content in it. These are books 2, 3, and 4. I had read book 1 in 2022. And so I finished out the series. There is another sequel series, but I have not read those yet. But these are The Jeweled Moth, The Painted Dragon, and The Midnight Peacock. These are in Victorian times. The characters are young kids that work at Sinclair's department store, and they're solving mysteries. And these are witty, they're funny, they're really good, they're wholesome. I think these are great books for teenagers, middle grade, children, depending on your kid's reading level. I loved them, and I did assign the first one to my oldest daughter this school year, so I will know pretty soon what she thinks of them as well. Next is another book by Catherine Rea. Now that is just the way I pronounce it. If you know that I'm wrong, please let me know. This is Lizzy and Jane. This tells the story of 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Jane, and Elizabeth has left her home in Seattle to go to New York to be a chef. while her sister Jane has stayed home and married and raised a family. The two sisters have been estranged for a very long time, ever since their mother's death, but Jane has just been diagnosed with cancer, and Lizzy comes to stay for a while. You get the family dynamics. You have the storyline of the sisters. You also have the storyline of the cancer. You have the storyline of Lizzy trying to figure out what she wants to do, if she still wants to be a chef, if she wants to do something different. There's a little romance. This book definitely made me cry. I've talked on here before of how I went through cancer, and luckily mine just required surgery. I didn't have to do chemo. I didn't have to do radiation. It's kind of an interesting thing because even though I didn't have to go through the things that the character went through, I do know what it's like to be told you have cancer and how scary that is. And so those kind of stories kind of hit differently now. This book definitely gave me all the feelings. There was one part in it where somebody accidentally cuts themselves with a knife that was pretty gross. But if you can handle that, the rest of the book is great. The next book was Authentically Izzy by Pepper Basham. This was the first Pepper Basham book I read. And in this, Izzy has a cousin that signs her up for an online dating service. She is not excited about it. She doesn't want to do that, but then she does end up meeting someone. And through this book, through emails and text messages, you're getting the correspondence between her and the person that she meets, but also with her and her cousins. And it was just a really fun read. She's a book lover. She's nerdy. So there are a lot of references that are fun if you are also those two things. I just really liked the characters and Pepper Basham's writing in this. Never before have I ever had a year that has so many Christian author fiction books on a list of favorites. I really didn't read that much in this area before 2023. I think it was because when I was growing up, most of the authors that I read that would be in that category, the books were really cheesy, not very well written. And so I kind of just classed them all together and thought, I just don't like this person's writing, so they must all be that way. And when I start, and some of them still are, obviously. There are differences in writing style and writing ability across the board in every genre and subgenre. And ones that I love, somebody else might think are terribly written. Some that I think are terribly written, somebody else loves. But I have found that for my personal taste over the last year, I have discovered so many authors in this area that I just love the stories they're putting out. So it's kind of funny to me when I was putting this pile together to see how many there were, because I never would have thought that. The next one up is Miss Newberries' list. This is by Megan Walker, and this was a book I picked up on a whim. My youngest daughter and I visited a local indie bookshop that had just opened in the small town next to us, and I wasn't finding anything I really wanted. Since they hadn't been open for very long and it was my first time there, I really wanted to buy something. And I saw this on a table, and it was the only thing that really stuck out to me as far as the cover and the synopsis. And since it's part of the Proper Romance from Shadow Mountain, which I believe is a Utah publisher, they're one that a lot of people I read that are Utah authors publish through, I knew it would probably be clean. And that was the problem with some of the other books I saw there that I didn't know much about. I just wasn't sure what I would be encountering in those books. So I decided to get this one. In this, Rosalind is counting down the days to when she marries a duke. She's only met him twice. She doesn't know him very well. And while she's counting down the days to their wedding, she pulls out this list that she created when she was younger. She had an aunt that got married and told her to make a list of the things that she wanted to do before she got married. So now she has pulled out this list from when she was a child. She wrote it with her best friend that lives in the next estate over, and she enlists her and her friend's brother, who just happens to be home at the time, kind of invites himself in, and they decide to help her to fulfill everything on this list before she gets married. And as they cross off everything on this list, it's just fun to watch their relationships grow. And it just turned out to be, like I said, one of my favorites. And I was so glad that I picked this up on a whim because I enjoyed it so much. Next, I read Romanof by Nadine Brandeis. Again, I don't know if I pronounced that right. And this was the first book I read by her. I have since bought 2 more that I hope to get to this next year. This is a retelling of the story of the Romanofs. She has included some magic elements in this book, and of course it does have a dark side to it, being the Romanoff story. If you've seen the movie Anastasia, it's kind of like that as far as the magic goes. I mean, it's darker, I think, than the cartoon, but it definitely has that element to it. What I loved is something that I heard before I read it that I ended up loving was the fact that she kind of tells you which things are true and which things aren't. at the end. And so you know that this is portraying the way that the Romanovs actually were looked at by the guards, where they were so kind to their guards that the guards had to be changed a lot because they would become sympathetic to them. And I love this cover, for one thing. I think this is one of the most beautiful covers of any book I own. And I just loved her writing, and I thought it was so interesting. And I think this would be a really good introduction to the Romanovs for a teen or for anyone who's interested in learning about them, to read something like this, and then they can deep dive into more historical stories that are nonfiction. Next, I read Man of Shadow and Mist by Michelle Grieb. Again, you can see this pattern of these authors that I've been trying out for the first time, and now I want to read everything they write. I loved this book. This is a retelling of Dracula. The man in it, James Morgan, he has returned from his estate in Transylvania to be with his mother who is dying. The disease that she has, he has as well. And so he is desperate for a cure. Rosa, the main heroine in the story, is a librarian with her dad. It kind of felt like Dracula meets Beauty and the Beast, because there was a character in it that loved her that very much reminded me of Gaston. And I thought it was so good and so interesting. Such a well done retelling of Dracula. My just turned 18 daughter has never read Dracula, and she loved this too. Next, I picked this collection of plays by Oscar Wilde. This has a few plays in it, but I chose it for The Importance of Being Earnest and An Ideal Husband. They're my two favorite plays. I love them. I love his writing. I love his wit and humor, and I just think that they're such fun plays. If you've read my homeschool wrap-up, you know that my daughter also read Importance of Being Earnest, and she did not like it as much as I did. She thought it was okay, but I love them. Next, I chose The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In this book, Ed Malone is chosen to join Professor Challenger on his next expedition to South America to try to find this lost world that he believes is there with dinosaurs. And so this tells the story of their adventures there. If you watched my December wrap-up, you know that I said that I really enjoy reading books about dinosaurs. That I'm very interested in dinosaurs. And so I found this very interesting, very fun to read, and it made me want to learn more about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and to read more of his books. Next, I chose The Vanderbeekers Ever After. This is the last book in the Vanderbeeker series. I talked about this a couple of months ago, that we read it as a family when it first came out and really enjoyed it. There is childhood cancer in this. It's pretty sad in comparison to the other Vanderbeekers books. It had a different feel than those ones, but we still really enjoyed it, and it was a really good experience reading it with my daughters. Next, I chose A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And like I said a minute ago, when I read The Lost World, I really wanted to read more of his writing. I'd read this a long time ago and didn't like it because of some of the elements in the story. And since I am no longer Mormon, I wanted to see how I felt about it now, since I knew how much I liked his writing. And I'm so glad I did, because I absolutely loved it this time around. I've heard some people that it's not their favorite, but I really enjoyed it. I felt like it was different and well done and just really entertaining. That's the main reason I've chosen this next year to read more Sherlock Holmes, is because I just want to see how all of them are, see if I feel the same way. The only ones at this point, the only ones I've really read are this and Hound of Baskerville. I think I read a few more when I was younger, but I just don't remember very much about them. And then I've seen the movies and the TV show, but I just really want to get in and read through all of them, see if there's ones that I don't like at all, see if there's other ones that I love. The next books I've chose are also a part of a series, the Ascendants series by Jennifer Nielsen, but I don't have them. They are my daughter's, and she has them upstairs. I started this series in 2022, so this only includes the last 3 books, The Shadow Throne, The Captive Kingdom, and Shattered Castle. I've said on here before that Jennifer Nielsen has become my 18-year-old's favorite author, and reading the Ascendants series was what got there. We love the historical fiction books that she writes. We've read them in homeschool, and both my daughters have loved them, but she really loves the fantasy books that Jennifer writes. And she's read all of the ones we own. I haven't read a lot of them yet, so I'm going to get to those this next year as well. But this has been her favorite series, and she just absolutely loves them. She's trying so hard to get my younger daughter to read them, but she hasn't yet. They're full of adventure. There's a little bit of romance, but not a lot. They're not too violent. They're completely clean, and they just have a really good story. You can trust the content. Next, I picked The Bridge by Karen Kingsbury, and I just talked about this in my December wrap-up. In this, there's a couple that owns a bookstore. They want to help people through the books in their bookstore. And then there is a boy and a girl that became friends, and spent a lot of time at this bookstore. And we're getting their story when they're a little bit older and haven't talked to each other for a few years. And they are looking back with and remembering their time at this bookshop. This book made me tear up a lot. It was perfect Christmas read. And then the last one I'm going to say was a favorite is The Secrets Beneath. I talked about this in my December wrap-up as well. This was the last book I read in December. In this book, Anna is a sketch artist with her paleontologist father and his team. And she sketches the fossils and things that they find. They have finally found a dinosaur, and they have to get permission to dig out these fossils and try to see what is in this hill that they've discovered. This was pitched to me as a book during the Bone Wars, and since I am so interested in archaeology and the Bone Wars, I was so excited to read it. But there really wasn't much to it about the Bone Wars themselves. She mentioned the names of two of the most notorious guys at that time, but she didn't talk much about them. So I'm hoping that in the rest of the series, she will go more into the Bone Wars and more into the actual dinosaurs and fossil collecting. This had kind of a side story that was going along with them doing this dig, but was pretty much the main story. And I do have to warn that it is a little bit darker than I thought it was going to be, but it was really good, and I really liked her writing, and I loved the faith element in this. And I also loved that even though it was a science book and these were paleontologists, that when they talked about these fossils being delivered, it was through the flood, and it was a faithful approach to it, which at this time people were starting to have different views, and I wasn't quite sure what the view would be of these characters on that, because almost every book out there has one view. I really loved how she added the faith in this. It was so well done, and there was a lot of it, but it didn't feel overly done. So I really appreciated that part of it, even when it came to the dark elements. Now I want to share the books that in my reading journal were just barely rated below my favorites. And they were so close to being the same rating as my favorites that I wanted to share them too as honorable mentions. First is another book by Catherine Rie. It's Dear Mr. Knightley. This is kind of a retelling of Daddy Longlegs, which I really enjoyed. This tells a story of a girl who grew up in foster care, and she has this benefactor that is helping her, that has helped her get through Northwestern University. Again, it takes place in Upper Illinois, in the areas that we were familiar with. And she must write letters to her donor to let him know how her progress is going, just like in Daddy Longlegs. I thought this was really fun and a really well done novel. Next, it was Game of Hearts by Joanna Barker. In this, Marigold really wants to compete in the archery tournaments, but it's very hard for her as a woman at this time. So she decides to start her own society for only the women. It's a pretty predictable Regency type romance. It seemed like something I wouldn't like before I read it, but I still thoroughly enjoyed the reading of it. It's probably not the perfect novel. It probably is cheesy in some parts, but it, for some reason, was something that really appealed to me, and I enjoyed my reading of it so much. The next was Bookshop of Secrets by Molly Rushmeyer. I read this with my old book club that we just ended at the end of 2023. And in this story, Hope has traveled to this bookshop because she is looking for old books that were left to her by her mother. And she has clues to where they are and is trying to find them. She wants to start kind of a food truck, but for books and food. And so she goes to this little bookshop. There's a man there with dementia, and then his wife that run the bookshop. They also have, I believe their grandson comes into the picture. And there's a lot more to the story than you think going in. I don't want to spoil too much, but I will say, since I didn't know going into it, and I think a lot of people don't, and I think sometimes it's something that's triggering to people, is that there is talk of trafficking in this book. I didn't know there was going to be anything more to it than her just finding her mom's books, but that added a whole layer to the story, and it was very heartfelt and really good. Next was The Silent Governess by Julie Klassen. This is one I talked about recently in the tag video of the girl that gets attacked in the forest and then she can't talk. And she overhears a secret. She's kept around for a while because they're not sure if she knows the secret or not. And she can't talk, and nobody knows if she's pretending not to be able to talk or if she really can't, and why she can't, and nobody knows who she is. Next is Codename Edelweiss by Stephanie Lansom. This takes place in 1933. Hitler is gaining power, and Liesel is kind of going through the Great Depression, and she's living in Los Angeles. And she is approached by a Jewish man, who believes that Hitler is infiltrating Hollywood. So when she loses her job at MGM, she decides to join him as a secret agent. And this whole story is based on a true story. It was very interesting and not like anything I'd read before. Next is another Julie Klassen book, The Sisters of Seew. This is a story about the Summer sisters that live on the Devonshire coast. And it kind of is, it has a Sense and Sensibility type feel to it. The stories, it tells the story of each sister. They all all the stories weave together, but all the sisters are very different and have their own little story going on in this book. It was pretty big, like most of her books tend to be. I do have the sequel to this now, and I'll be reading that in the next little while. But once again, I really loved the characters and her writing. Next was The Prophet Calls by Melanie Sumrow. This is a middle grade that tells the story of Gentry, a young girl that lives in a polygamous community. It does a really good job of showing how the prophet of these polygamous groups rules everything and what it would feel like to be in one. I've read quite a few nonfiction books of women that were in polygamous groups and what it was like for them and how they escaped or why they escaped. And this felt very real. She definitely did her research on this, and I'm pretty sure that there's some true elements to this. I think it's based on some real people. And if not, the story is very similar to some of the other stories I've read. And living in Utah and coming from a Mormon family, I do have ancestors that were polygamous. And I have seen polygamists ever since we moved back to Utah. You see them at the grocery store. There used to be a community very close to my best friend's house in junior high. And there were nights sometimes when we would go over by their community and there were some boys that would come out and we would talk to them. I've seen some documentaries since then and found out that there was a school there, so I think they were the ones going to that school. I used to work with a girl that had left a polygamous community, and her mom worked with us as well, and she was still in it. While I definitely don't know what it's like to be a polygamist, it's something I've been very aware of for most of my life, and it is a heartbreaking part of Mormon heritage, and it's a heartbreaking thing people are still going through. And I think it's really important for people to read about these things and realize that it never has been a victimless crime. It has always been something that is wrong. Next up was The Van Gogh Deception by Darren Hicks. This starts out with a young boy being found in the National Gallery Museum, and he doesn't remember who he is or how he got there. Nobody knows who he is. And so he goes to stay with a woman and her daughter, and the police are trying to figure out who he is. And meanwhile, he starts getting chased by some dangerous people, and he doesn't know why. This is a middle grade, and I found it to actually be really exciting and really fun and really well written. I did pick up the sequel after this, and I did not like it at all. So this will be the only book I read by him, and it's fine because it's a standalone and you don't have to read anymore. And the last honorable mention I will talk about is another Catherine Rie. It's The Bronte Plot. In this, Lucy sells rare books, but she doesn't always have integrity in the way she's selling them. She ends up going to England to be a consultant for her boyfriend's grandmother, and it's through that trip with her that she really finds herself, figures out what is right and wrong. And there were a couple of things in this that I wish had been done differently, and that was why it didn't become an absolute favorite, but I still really enjoyed the story and, again, her writing. Now I'm going to share my favorite nonfiction of 2023. Only a few of the nonfiction books I read made my absolute favorite list, but I did want to share them separately from the fiction. The first is Lighthouse, Gerald and Sandra Tanner by Ronald V. Huggins. This is about a couple that lived here in Utah. He has passed away, but Sandra is still alive, and they ran the Utah Lighthouse ministry together, and then she has been running it after he died until last year when she retired. And this tells the story of how they went from just your average normal Mormon couple to some of the most hated critics of the LDS Church. And they did not deserve it. They would find information that was correct and true, and they shared it. And they were made out to be villains. But then, as the internet has come around, people have found out that the things that they've been sharing for years were true. And in fact, in the 1990s, there was a man who fooled the entire Mormon church leadership with fake letters. And Gerald Tanner, even though he was a critic of the church, and the letter that this guy was selling to the church could have been harmful to the church, he was still one of the only voices that said, I don't think it's real. And he was right. If people had listened to him, some lives might have been saved because people died. You can see the documentary about this. I believe it's called The Mormon Murders. I think it's on Netflix or Hulu. And so this is a really interesting book. about their life and how they got to the place where they were and the things that they had to go through. Next is 12 Ordinary Men by John MacArthur. John MacArthur is my favorite religious author. I love listening to his sermons and I love reading his books. This book goes through each of Jesus's disciples using the Bible and other historical sources to tell us everything that we can possibly know about these 12 men. And it's so good. I also have Right Thinking for a Culture in Chaos. This is put together by John MacArthur and Nathan Busenitz. I could be pronouncing that wrong. This just basically looks at a lot of our cultural issues that we're going through right now. I believe this came out a long time ago and then they've updated it. And it shows the way to look at these things biblically. I also, in 2023, finished what I started in 2022, which was reading the Bible with this ESV Study Bible. And it's very torn up. It's been very loved and used. And I had a King James Bible, but I would read from there and then read from this ESV Study Bible and then make notes in my King James. And this was life-changing. Next is this book that's kind of like a graphic novel. It's got more words than pictures, but there is a lot of pictures in it. And this is called The Faithful Spy by John Hendricks. It tells the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his plot to kill Hitler. Every Woman a Theologian by Felicia Masonheimer. I read this with the Revived Christian Book Club. It was so helpful in learning the basics of Christianity, just having a review of them and some of the things I didn't know. And I just really, really enjoyed this. And then Truth Changes Everything by Dr. Jeff Myers. I got this for free at the homeschool convention my mom and I went to last June in Colorado. He talks about different Christ followers throughout history that have changed the world with his truth. I made lots of notes, underlined a lot of things, and I'm really excited because this year I'm going to be reading it again with my mom, and I know that I'm going to get even more out of it having her to talk to about it as I read it. And the last two books I would have had in my absolute favorite books, but they were rereads, and I usually try to keep the absolute favorites as books that I've read for the first time. So these are A Night Divided by Jennifer Nielsen that I just talked about. This is the one that she wrote about the Berlin Wall, and we read this in homeschool this year, and my girls loved it. I loved it again. It's a great book. And God's Smuggler by Brother Andrew. When I heard that he had died, I really wanted to read it again. And this tells the story of Brother Andrew and how he came to faith and then how he smuggled Bibles into different places around the world. And it is such an inspiring and wonderful story. So I highly recommend all of these books I've shared. I know it was a lot. And, some of them might be in genres you don't enjoy as much. So you might not enjoy them as much as I did. But I'm sure that there's something there for everybody. I feel like I read a lot of great books this year. And these were just the best of the best, at least for the place I'm in my life right now. And the moods I was in, I guess, when I was reading them. I would love to hear what your favorite books were this year. I'm really looking forward to 2024 and hoping to have another pile this big of favorite books.